Concrete floors echo differently when your bank account is empty. 5 years ago, David walked out of a cramped, roach-infested apartment because he couldn't stand the smell of poverty anymore. He left his wife crying on a thrift store mattress to marry into generational wealth. Now, stripped of that borrowed fortune and desperate for a paycheck, he's sitting in the sterile waiting room of a billion-dollar tech firm. He's just praying the CEO doesn't recognize him. Because the CEO? It's her, mildew and fried onions. That was the scent of their marriage. David zipped his canvas duffel bag, the cheap zipper catching on a frayed thread. He yanked it hard. It tore, but it closed. He didn't care. He wouldn't be using this bag ever again anyway. From the kitchen, the rhythmic dripping of the leaky faucet seemed to mock him. Drip, drip. Each drop sounded like the pennies they didn't have. Nora was sitting at the wobbly laminate dining table, her fingers stained with blue dry erase marker. She was staring at him. She hadn't screamed. She hadn't thrown anything. That actually made it worse. He wanted her to throw the chipped mug she was holding, so he could feel justified, so he could point at her and say she was crazy, that this was why he was leaving. Instead, she just looked at him with red, swollen eyes. Her nose was running. She wiped it with the back of her sleeve, leaving a faint streak of snot on the gray cotton. It wasn't a dignified Hollywood crying scene. It was ugly. It was real. "You're really doing this," Nora said. Her voice was raspy, scraped raw from the hour of pleading that preceded this deadened silence. "You're going to her." "I'm going to a life, Nora," David said, trying to keep his voice level, reasonable. He adjusted his collar. The shirt was worn thin at the neck. Chloe had promised to take him to an Italian tailor on Tuesday. The thought of crisp, heavy cotton made his mouth water more than food. "I can't do this anymore. I'm 32. I have a degree. I shouldn't be eating ramen 3 nights a week while you burn through our savings on a supply chain algorithm no one wants." "It works, David," she whispered, her knuckles white around the mug. "I finally cracked the predictive routing. I just need a meeting, just one meeting with a distributor." "Stop," he held up a hand. The overhead fluorescent light flickered, casting a sickly yellow pallor over her tired face. She looked older than 30. The stress had carved deep lines around her mouth. Her hair, which he used to love, was tied in a messy, greasy knot. "Just stop, Nora. It's been 3 years. It's a pipe dream. We're drowning." "So you found a lifeboat," she said bitterly. Her chest hitched, a ragged intake of breath. "Chloe's father, the VP title, the corner office. You're selling me out for an air-conditioned office and a woman who looks down on you." "She doesn't look down on me." David grabbed his bag. The handle dug into his palm. It felt heavy. The guilt was there, a dull ache behind his ribs, but the exhaustion was heavier. He was so tired of calculating the cost of toilet paper. He was tired of his car breaking down on the freeway in the rain. He wanted out. He deserved out. "She does, Dave," Nora said. She stood up. The chair scraped harshly against the linoleum. "Her family will eat you alive. You're a charity case to them. A pet." Anger flared hot and sudden in his chest. "At least I'll be a pet with health insurance," he snapped. He immediately regretted the volume, glancing at the thin walls. The neighbors would hear. They always heard. Nora flinched. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, suddenly looking very small. The defiance drained out of her, replaced by a devastating vulnerability. She walked toward him, her bare feet sticking slightly to the cheap flooring. She smelled of old coffee and desperation. "Please," she choked out, her facade crumbling. "Dave, please, I love you. We promised, for better or worse." She reached for his arm. He stepped back. It was an instinct, a recoil from the grime of their life together, but he saw the exact second it broke her. Her hand hovered in the empty space between them. The air in the apartment felt thick, unbreathable. "I've done the worse," David said softly. His throat felt tight. "I can't wait for the better anymore." He turned and walked out the door. He didn't look back as he went down the 3 flights of stairs, the smell of boiled cabbage lingering in the stairwell. When he pushed through the heavy metal front door and stepped out into the humid city night, a sleek black Mercedes was idling by the curb. The tinted window rolled down, revealing Chloe. Her blonde hair was perfectly blown out. She smelled like sandalwood and money. David threw his torn duffel into the trunk and climbed into the passenger seat. The leather was buttery soft, instantly contouring to his back. The air conditioning blasted cool, filtered air against his sweating forehead. "You did it?" Chloe asked, not looking at him, her thumbs flying across her glowing phone screen. "I did," David said. He stared out the windshield at his old apartment building. The neon liquor store sign buzzed on the corner, casting a red stain over the cracked sidewalk. "Good," she said, putting the car in drive. "Let's go get you a decent drink. You look exhausted." As they pulled away, David felt a brief, sharp pang in his gut, a phantom limb sensation. But then the engine purred, smooth and silent, and the smell of fried onions faded into the scent of expensive perfume. He leaned his head back against the headrest and closed his eyes. He had made the right choice. He had to have. 4 years later, the leather in the Mercedes didn't feel as soft. David sat in the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel until his joints popped. Outside, the rain lashed against the windshield in angry, rhythmic sheets. The wipers squeaked, a harsh, abrasive sound that scraped against his frayed nerves. He was parked outside a monolithic glass building in the financial district. It was 11:45 p.m. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. The screen lit up. Chloe. He stared at the name. His stomach churned, a sour mix of cheap scotch and anxiety. He didn't pick up. He knew what she would say. The divorce papers had been served 2 weeks ago, dropped on his mahogany desk by a process server who looked thoroughly bored by David's ruin. Nora had been right. It took 4 years, but she had been dead right. The first 2 years had been intoxicating. High-rise condos, tailored suits, networking dinners where men in $10,000 watches laughed at his mediocre jokes because of who his father-in-law was. David had played the part well. He was the handsome, hard-working husband to the socialite daughter. He managed a mid-level portfolio at the firm, doing just enough to justify his salary, but never enough to threaten the real power players. But old money operates on a different frequency. They didn't see him as a peer. They saw him as an acquisition, and acquisitions depreciate. Chloe got bored. It wasn't a dramatic affair or a fiery blowout. It was a slow, agonizing freeze. She started taking long trips to Aspen without him. She redecorated his home office into a yoga studio without asking. When he tried to complain, her father, Arthur, had pulled him aside at a country club dinner. "You're here to make her happy, David," Arthur had said, swirling a glass of Macallan. His voice was pleasant, but his eyes were like dead stones. If she's not happy, your utility is severely diminished. When she finally filed, the ironclad prenup he had signed, eager to prove he wasn't after her money, snapped shut like a bear trap. He got nothing. No alimony, no shares in the firm. He was given 30 days to vacate the penthouse and a meager severance package that barely covered the lease on the Mercedes he was now sitting in. He picked up the phone as it stopped vibrating. He had 3 unread emails. 2 were rejection letters for mid-level management roles. The third was a past due notice for his credit card. The severance had dried up fast. Living like a rich man was an expensive habit to break. He had burned through his cash trying to maintain appearances, buying drinks for colleagues who slowly stopped returning his texts. The truth was, his resume was a joke. 5 years at a massive firm as a vice president of strategic relations, a title that meant absolutely nothing. He had no hard skills. He hadn't built anything. He had just existed in a very expensive room. David leaned his forehead against the cold steering wheel. The panic was a physical weight in his chest, pressing down on his lungs. He was 37. He had $412 in his checking account. The lease on the car was up next week, and he was currently renting a studio apartment in a neighborhood that smelled suspiciously like the one he had abandoned. He unlocked his phone and opened his browser. He had spent the last 6 hours scouring job boards, applying for anything that paid a living wage. Logistics manager, operations coordinator, data analyst. He didn't care anymore. He refreshed the page. A new listing popped up. Operations director, Aegis Innovations. Base salary, $160,000, immediate hire. Aegis Innovations. He had heard the name. Everyone in the corporate sector had heard the name lately. They were a massive disruptor in global supply chain logistics. They had come out of nowhere a year ago, aggressively acquiring shipping routes and streamlining distribution with a proprietary AI that was completely cannibalizing the old guard. David tapped the screen, scrolling through the requirements. It was a stretch, a massive stretch. But the application process was surprisingly simple. No cover letter, just a resume upload and a short preliminary questionnaire. He was desperate. Desperation lowers your standards for self-preservation. He attached his bloated resume, clicked submit, and threw the phone onto the passenger seat. He didn't expect to hear back. But at 8 a.m. the next morning, his phone rang. A crisp, professional voice on the other end invited him for an in-person interview that afternoon. "We move fast at Aegis, Mr. Vance," the recruiter had said. David hadn't questioned it. He had spent the morning ironing his one remaining good suit, a charcoal Tom Ford that was a little loose on him now due to the stress-induced weight loss. He polished his shoes until his arms ached. Now he was here. Aegis Innovations was headquartered in a massive, brutalist concrete and glass structure that looked more like a modern art museum than a corporate office. David pushed through the revolving doors, instantly hit by a wall of aggressively conditioned air. It smelled like ozone and expensive green tea. The lobby was vast and intimidating, with a 50-foot ceiling and a living wall of ferns that probably cost more than his entire net worth. His shoes clicked loudly on the polished slate floor. He felt intensely exposed. The people walking past him, young, sharp-eyed, carrying sleek tablets, moved with a frenetic, predatory energy. He felt like a dinosaur, a slow, tired dinosaur in a fading suit. He approached the reception desk. The woman behind it didn't look up from her monitor. "David Vance," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He cleared his throat. Interview for the operations director role, 2 p.m. She typed something, then handed him a heavy, matte black key card. Floor 42, executive suite. Take the express elevator on your left. David frowned, taking the card. Executive suite? For a director role? The receptionist finally looked up. Her expression was completely blank. Floor 42, Mr. Vance. The elevator ride was terrifyingly fast. His stomach dropped as the numbers blurred on the digital display. His palms were sweating. He discreetly wiped them on his trousers, hoping it wouldn't leave a mark. He needed this job. He needed it to eat, to pay rent, to prove to Arthur and Chloe and everyone who looked at him with pity that he wasn't a total failure. The doors chimed and slid open. Floor 42 was silent. The carpeting was so thick it swallowed his footsteps entirely. The lighting was moody, focused on abstract sculptures and massive sweeping windows that offered a dizzying view of the city below. Mr. Vance, David jumped. A man in a sharp black suit was waiting for him at the end of the hall. Right this way, the CEO will see you now. David's heart hammered against his ribs. The CEO? Why was the CEO interviewing a mid-level director? Was this a final round? Had they fast-tracked him based on his previous firm's name? He swallowed hard, adjusting his tie, and followed the man toward a pair of towering frosted glass doors. The man opened the door and gestured for David to enter. David walked in. The office was cavernous. A massive raw-edge walnut desk dominated the room, positioned in front of a floor-to-ceiling window. The sky outside was a bruised, threatening purple. A leather chair was turned away from him, facing the window. "Have a seat, David," a voice said. David froze. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt dizzy. His knees instantly locked. He knew that voice. It was polished now, devoid of the exhaustion and the gravelly rasp he remembered, but the cadence was unmistakable. No. The leather chair swiveled around. Nora sat there. She wasn't the woman crying in the cheap gray cotton shirt. She was unrecognizable, yet terrifyingly familiar. She wore a perfectly tailored bone-white blazer. Her hair, once a messy, greasy knot, was cut in a sharp, blunt bob that framed her face. Her skin looked flawless, glowing with the kind of health that only comes from extreme wealth, but it was her eyes that stopped his heart. They weren't red or swollen. They were flat, cold, and utterly terrifying. They looked at him the way a scientist looks at a microbe on a slide. "Hello, Dave," Nora said. She didn't smile. She just rested her elbows on the desk, interlacing her fingers. A massive diamond caught the dim light, flashing sharply. She was married. David couldn't speak. His mouth opened, but only a dry, raspy sound came out. He felt like the air had been vacuumed from the room. He grabbed the back of the guest chair to steady himself, the leather smooth and cold under his damp palm. Aegis, her algorithm, the one he called a pipe dream. She hadn't just gotten a meeting. She had built an empire. "Nora?" he finally managed to croak out. He sounded pathetic. He hated how he sounded. "Have a seat," she repeated. It wasn't a request. David slowly sank into the chair. His mind was screaming, a chaotic static of humiliation and shock. He wanted to run. He wanted to stand up, walk out the door, and never look back. But he couldn't. He had $400 to his name. The gravity of his complete failure pinned him to the seat. Nora picked up a sleek black tablet. She tapped the screen once. Your resume is incredibly bloated, she said, her tone conversational, like she was discussing the weather. 5 years at Vanguard Holdings, Vice President of Strategic Relations. A title created entirely to stroke your ego while keeping you away from any actual ledgers. David flinched as if she had slapped him. Nora, please! Address me as Ms. Hayes in this building, she cut in, her voice slicing through his plea like a scalpel. She didn't raise her voice, which made it so much worse. David swallowed, his throat clicking loudly in the quiet room. Ms. Hayes, I didn't know this was your company. I know you didn't, Nora said. She leaned back in her chair. The faint scent of expensive dark roast espresso drifted across the desk. It smelled nothing like the cheap burnt grounds they used to drink. If you had known, your pride wouldn't have let you apply. But your pride is a luxury you can no longer afford, isn't it, David? She knew everything. He could see it in the slight, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw. She had watched him fall. She had probably tracked his divorce, his firing, his slow slide down the social ladder. I need a job, David whispered, stripping away the last agonizing layer of his dignity. He hated the slight tremble in his hands, so he buried them between his knees. You do, Nora agreed smoothly. She dropped the tablet onto the desk. Clack. The sound echoed in the massive room. But you have no skills, David. You don't know logistics. You don't know code. You spent the last half-decade playing golf and carrying your ex-wife's bags. Then why am I here? David snapped, a sudden, desperate flare of his old temper breaking through the humiliation. To gloat? To watch me beg? You brought me up here just to twist the knife? Nora stared at him for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Outside, a crack of thunder rumbled, vibrating against the thick glass of the office windows. Slowly, Nora stood up. She walked around the desk. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor, sharp, measured strikes. She stopped a few feet from his chair, looking down at him. I didn't bring you here to watch you beg, David, she said, her voice dropping to a low, quiet hum. I brought you here because I have a very specific problem, and ironically, you are exactly the kind of man I need to solve it. She crossed her arms, the white fabric of her blazer stark against the bruised skyline behind her. I'm offering you the job, but you're not going to like it. Sweat pooled beneath David's collar, cold and slick. He stared at Nora, trying to find a trace of the woman who used to burn toast on Sunday mornings. There was nothing, just a polished void. What problem? David asked. His voice was steadier now, though his stomach still twisted violently. Aegis recently acquired a regional distribution center in the industrial sector of the harbor, Nora said, her tone devoid of any theatricality. It was pure business. It's a massive, rotting liability. The union is hostile. The inventory shrinkage is sitting at an abysmal 14%. The current floor management is either dangerously incompetent or actively stealing from us. She picked up a sleek stylus, rolling it between her thumb and forefinger. I need an operations director on the ground, someone who isn't part of the Aegis corporate ecosystem, someone expendable. She looked right through him. If I send one of my sharp, young executives down there, the warehouse floor will eat them alive. They speak in algorithms. The people at the harbor speak in diesel and overtime. I need a corporate shield, someone who looks like a suit but has absolutely nothing to lose when the axe falls. David gripped the armrests of his chair, The leather squeaked under his damp palms. "You're sending me to a failing warehouse to be a scapegoat." "I am sending you to a failing warehouse to do a job," Nora corrected, her eyes narrowing slightly. "The base salary is $160,000. If you fix the shrinkage and identify the rot, there's a bonus. If you fail, you are terminated. No severance, no recommendations." "Why me?" he pushed, the frustration cracking his polite facade. "You have the money. You could hire a veteran logistics guy, a fixer." Nora stood up and walked to the massive window. The purple sky outside suddenly cracked with a bright, jagged vein of lightning. Rain began to violently pelt the glass. "Because a fixer will play the game, David. A fixer has a reputation to protect. You don't." She didn't turn around. Her voice was barely audible over the drumming rain. "And because I know you, you are a survivor. You will claw and scratch and sell out anyone to keep your head above water. You proved that to me 4 years ago." The words hit him like a physical blow to the ribs. It wasn't a vindictive scream. It was a cold, clinical observation. It hurt infinitely worse. "Take it or leave it," she said, finally turning back to him. She checked a slim silver watch on her wrist. "I have a board meeting in 4 minutes. David thought about his studio apartment, the lingering smell of stale beer from the hallway, the final notice on his electricity bill. He thought about Arthur laughing at him over a glass of 50-year-old scotch. "I'll take it," David said. His voice was a hollow rasp. "Human Resources will email you the onboarding packet," Nora said, sitting back down and pulling her tablet closer. "Report to Harbor Depot 42 at 5 a.m. on Monday. Dress for mud." She didn't look up again. He was dismissed. Monday morning felt like chewing on tin foil. David parked his leased Mercedes, which he had precisely 4 days left to return, in a pothole-ridden gravel lot. It was 4:45 a.m. The sky was the color of bruised iron. The air here didn't smell like ozone or expensive green tea. It smelled heavily of sulfur, wet asphalt, and the sharp, choking tang of diesel exhaust. Depot 42 was a sprawling, rusted behemoth of corrugated metal and cracked concrete. Massive semi-trucks idled in the loading bays, their engines a low, constant vibration that rattled the fillings in David's teeth. He stepped out of the car. He had worn his dark gray Tom Ford suit, ditching the tie and wearing thick boots. It was a pathetic compromise between the VP he used to be and the grunt he was supposed to become. Within 3 steps, a murky puddle splashed up, staining the hem of his tailored trousers with oily, black grit. He cursed under his breath. Inside, the noise was deafening. The piercing beep, beep, beep of reversing forklifts cut through the heavy mechanical hum of the conveyor belts. Fluorescent lights hung from the massive ceiling, half of them flickering, casting violent, strobing shadows across the dust-choked air. He found the management office, a standalone insulated trailer sitting on cinder blocks in the corner of the warehouse floor. He yanked the heavy metal door open. The smell of mildew and stale, burnt coffee hit him instantly. His chest tightened. It was the exact smell of his old apartment with Nora. A man was sitting behind a battered metal desk, eating a powdered donut over a stack of smeared shipping manifests. He was built like a cinder block, wearing a high-visibility yellow vest smeared with grease. He looked up, chewing slowly. "You lost, suit?" the man grunted. "I'm David, the new operations director. The man stopped chewing. He looked David up and down, taking in the ruined Tom Ford trousers and the pale, exhausted face. He let out a harsh, barking laugh, spraying a fine mist of powdered sugar onto the desk. "Director," the man mocked, wiping his mouth with the back of a thick, calloused hand. "Right, I'm Miller, floor manager. Welcome to the graveyard." "I need the inventory ledgers for the past 6 months," David said, trying to summon the authoritative tone he used to use on junior analysts at his old firm. It sounded weak, swallowed by the roar of a forklift passing outside the trailer. Miller didn't move. "Ledgers are in the filing cabinets, the ones that ain't broken. System's down. Been down since Friday." "Then fix it," David snapped, his headache flaring. Miller stood up. He was a full head taller than David, and broad enough to eclipse the flickering overhead light. He leaned over the desk. He smelled of sweat, cheap tobacco, and open hostility. "Listen to me, pretty boy," Miller said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I don't know whose nephew you are at corporate or who you kissed up to get this babysitting gig. But you don't run the floor. I run the floor. You sit in your little chair, you sign the safety compliance forms, and you stay out of my way. Or you're going to find out how easy it is to get crushed between 2 pallets in the blind spot of a loader." David stood his ground, though his heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against his sternum. He wanted to back down. Every instinct bred into him over the last 4 years of country clubs and corner offices screamed at him to apologize and retreat. But then he remembered Nora's cold, flat eyes. "You are a survivor. You will claw and scratch." He didn't have Arthur's money to hide behind anymore. He had nothing, and a man with nothing is a dangerous thing to threaten. "I am not corporate's nephew," David said. His voice dropped, losing the artificial executive polish. It was raw, scraped out of his dry throat. "I am the guy they sent to find out why 14% of this depot's freight is vanishing into thin air. I'm here because I'm expendable, Miller, which means if I go down, I am absolutely dragging everyone in this room down with me." David grabbed a stack of manifests off Miller's desk, the grease instantly transferring to his clean hands. "I want the ledgers, and I want the system back online in an hour. Or I start walking the floor and asking the union reps why their floor manager is hiding the shrink numbers." Miller stared at him. The silence in the trailer was heavy, thick with unspoken violence. Then Miller scoffed, stepping back. "Cabinet 3, Miller spat. "Knock yourself out, director." For the next 2 weeks, David didn't sleep. He lived in the trailer. The salary meant nothing because he had no time to spend a dime of it. He bought cheap, rigid work jeans from a big box store and steel-toed boots that gave him agonizing blisters. His tailored suits hung uselessly in his closet back at the studio. The work was grueling. It wasn't the abstract, sanitized spreadsheets he was used to. It was physical. The digital system was a mess, deliberately tangled by whoever was skimming the inventory. To find the leak, David had to cross-reference the digital logs with the physical, carbon copy bills of lading that the truckers handed in. His hands were permanently stained with black ink and warehouse grit. He developed a deep, hacking cough from the diesel fumes. He ate stale crackers from the vending machine and drank coffee that tasted like battery acid. Every night around 2 a.m., the massive warehouse would briefly fall silent during the shift change. David would sit in the dim light of the trailer, rubbing his burning, bloodshot eyes, staring at a mountain of paperwork. It was during these quiet, desperate hours that the realization hit him. This was what Nora had done. For 3 years, she had sat at their wobbly laminate kitchen table, her fingers stained with marker, running on zero sleep and cheap coffee, building her predictive routing algorithm. He had called it a pipe dream. He had complained about the smell of mildew and the lack of money, entirely blind to the agonizing, obsessive labor she was pouring into their future. He had wanted the reward without the grit. Now, covered in grease, his back screaming in pain, staring at routing numbers until his vision blurred, he finally understood the weight of her ambition. The guilt didn't come as a sudden tearful epiphany. It came as a slow, crushing pressure in his chest, a heavy, useless shame that made it hard to breathe. He had left her because he hated the struggle. Now the struggle was the only thing keeping him alive. By the end of the 3rd week, David found the thread. It was buried deep in the outbound shipping logs. A subtle, recurring discrepancy. Trucks carrying high-value electronics, mostly microprocessors and specialized medical tech, were logging their departure weights perfectly. But when David physically pulled the waystation tickets from the third-party security gate, the numbers were off. Not by a lot, just by a few £100 per truck, just enough to be written off as standard packaging variants or a calibration error on the scales. But it happened every Tuesday and Thursday, consistently, on routes managed by 3 specific drivers. And all 3 drivers reported directly to Miller. They were loading phantom pallets, logging them into the Aegis system, but physically diverting them before the trucks ever hit the highway. It was a sophisticated, organized bleed. David sat at his desk. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Thursday. Rain hammered relentlessly against the tin roof of the trailer, a deafening rhythmic assault. His desk was completely buried in highlighted manifests. His neck was cramped into a permanent, agonizing knot. He needed proof. Paper wasn't enough. He needed to physically intercept the diverted load. He stood up, grabbing his heavy canvas jacket. His muscles ached with a dull, persistent throb. As he reached for the doorknob, a harsh knock rattled the metal. David froze. The floor was supposed to be empty for the next hour. Before he could speak, the door opened. Nora stepped into the trailer. She looked entirely out of place, an alien entity in the grimy ecosystem of the depot. She wore a tailored black trench coat, belted tightly at the waist, and black leather boots. Her hair was perfectly sleek, untouched by the torrential rain outside. She carried a matte black umbrella, dripping water onto the stained linoleum floor. David stared at her, acutely aware of how he looked. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt, stained with carbon dust. His jeans were smeared with grease. He hadn't shaved in 4 days, and his eyes were ringed with deep purple shadows of exhaustion. He felt a sudden, burning flash of humiliation. He wanted to hide. Nora closed the door behind her. She didn't flinch at the smell of mildew and sweat. She looked around the cramped, messy trailer, her flat eyes taking in the mountains of paper, the empty coffee cups, the flickering fluorescent bulb overhead. "You look terrible," she said quietly. "Good evening to you too, Ms. Hayes," David rasped. His throat was dry. He walked back to his desk, putting a physical barrier between them. "Corporate checking in on the scapegoat? Or did you just want to see the mud for yourself?" She ignored the sarcasm. She walked over to the desk, looking down at the spread of manifests. Her eyes darted across the highlighted numbers. She was fast. He watched her mentally calculate the variances, her brow furrowing slightly. "You're pulling physical way station tickets?" she observed, her voice losing a fraction of its icy detachment. "You bypassed the Aegis digital audit entirely." "The digital audit is compromised," David said, leaning his weight on his knuckles against the desk. "Whoever set up the skim is in the IT routing department. They're scrubbing the digital logs to match the fraudulent manifests, but they can't scrub the third-party analog scales at the gate." Nora looked up at him. For the first time since he had walked into her pristine office, she looked at him with something resembling actual focus, not pity, not vengeance, just intense, calculating focus. "How long have you been tracking this?" 2 weeks, David said. He rubbed the back of his neck, wincing at the stiffness. "Miller is the anchor. He's authorizing the phantom loads. The trucks leave Bay 4, bypass the secondary inspection lane, and head straight to a holding yard off I-95. You have proof?" "I have a pattern," David corrected. "I need to catch them loading it." Nora was silent. The rain drummed furiously above them. She reached out and touched one of the carbon copy bills. Her fingers, manicured and clean, brushed against the smudged blue ink. "You're doing manual cross-referencing," she murmured, almost to herself. "Thousands of pages. It's the only way to find the ghost in the machine," David said. He looked at her hand, remembering how those fingers used to be perpetually stained with dry erase marker. The memory was a sharp, sudden ache in his chest. "I know a thing or two about obsessing over supply chains late at night." Nora's hand froze. She slowly pulled it back, tucking it into the pocket of her trench coat. The brief moment of professional connection shattered, replaced instantly by the cold, impenetrable armor of the CEO. "Don't," she warned. Her voice was a soft, dangerous whisper. "Do not try to draw parallels, David. You are not doing this out of passion or brilliance. You are doing this because you are trapped." "I know," David fired back, the exhaustion stripping away his filter. "I know exactly why I'm here, Nora. You made it abundantly clear. I'm doing the miserable, grinding work that nobody else wants to do. I'm eating dirt so your numbers look good." He stepped around the desk, closing the distance between them. He didn't care about the mud on his boots or the grease on his shirt. "But I'm doing it," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh rasp. "I haven't quit. I haven't run back to a country club. So drop the act. You didn't come all the way down to this toxic dump at midnight in the pouring rain just to check my math." Nora stood perfectly still. The flickering light cast harsh shadows across her cheekbones. She looked at him, really looked at him, at the dirt under his fingernails, the desperate, exhausted fire in his eyes. The perfectly groomed hollow man she had married was gone. "There's a board meeting tomorrow at 8 a.m., she said, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "A massive restructuring vote. Arthur's firm is making a hostile push to acquire a controlling stake in Aegis." David's breath hitched. Arthur, his ex-father-in-law, the man who had discarded him. "Arthur wants Aegis?" David asked, his mind racing. "He wants the algorithm," Nora corrected. "And he's bought out 3 of my board members to force a vote of no confidence against me. They're citing extreme operational bleed, specifically the 14% shrinkage at this exact depot." David stared at her, the pieces suddenly slamming together with sickening clarity. "This depot isn't just a failing subsidiary," David whispered, the horror creeping into his voice. "It's the weapon they're using to oust you. Yes. And Miller, The IT guy, the phantom roots. David's eyes widened. They aren't just stealing inventory to sell on the black market. They're deliberately bleeding the company to tank the quarterly margins. Nora didn't blink. Arthur is funding the theft. He's paying Miller to burn my company down from the inside so he can buy the ashes. The silence in the trailer was absolute, save for the rain. I need the proof, David, Nora said, her voice finally breaking, revealing a sliver of the desperate, determined woman he used to know. I need the proof by 8 a.m., or I lose everything I built. David looked at the clock. It was midnight. He had 8 hours to tear down a ghost network, confront a hostile floor manager, and save the empire of the woman he had abandoned. He grabbed a heavy steel flashlight from his desk. Then we better go catch a truck, he said. Rain slashed sideways against the corrugated metal siding of the depot, a deafening, rhythmic assault that drowned out the sound of their breathing. David led the way down the narrow, dimly lit catwalk above the main floor. The metal grating was slick with grease and condensation. He gripped the handrail tightly, his knuckles white, terrified his boots would slip. Below them, the warehouse was a cavernous maw of shadows. The midnight shift change meant the floor was practically deserted, save for a few automated pallet jacks humming mindlessly in the distance. Nora moved silently behind him. She had discarded the umbrella, her trench coat now damp, heavy, and clinging to her shoulders. She didn't complain. She just watched the shadows with those flat, calculating eyes. Bay 4, David whispered, his voice catching in his dry throat. He pointed toward a massive roll-up door at the far south end. A single semi-truck idled there. Its headlights were off, but the deep, guttural rumble of its diesel engine vibrated through the metal catwalk beneath their feet. A forklift was reversing out of the trailer, the backup alarm muffled by someone who had duct-taped the speaker. David tasted battery acid at the back of his throat. He was an office worker, a guy who used to complain if his ergonomic chair wasn't adjusted properly. Now, his heart was hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against his ribs, his lungs burning with the smell of exhaust and wet dust. They crept down the metal stairwell, the squeak of their wet shoes echoing far too loudly. As they reached the concrete floor, a voice cracked like a whip through the humid air. "You're a long way from your trailer, Director." David froze. A heavy, blinding beam from a tactical flashlight hit him square in the face. He threw his arm up, squinting through the glare. Miller stepped out from behind a stack of wooden pallets. He held a massive steel crowbar in his right hand. He didn't look like he was going to use it to pry open crates. He looked entirely too comfortable holding it. Two other men, the drivers David had identified in the logs, stepped out of the shadows behind him, wiping grease from their hands with filthy rags. "And you brought a friend," Miller grunted, panning the light to illuminate Nora. He paused, taking in her tailored coat and pristine boots. He let out a low, mocking whistle. "Must be some friend to drag her into this dump. Or maybe corporate sent the big guns." "Turn the light off, Miller," Nora said. Her voice was steady, absolute ice. It didn't tremble. Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. He lowered the beam slightly, but kept it on them. "I don't think so. See, we're doing some late-night restructuring of our own here. You two are trespassing in an active loading zone, a very dangerous place. Accidents happen all the time. People slip, pallets fall." David stepped in front of Nora. It wasn't a heroic, movie star maneuver. He stumbled slightly over a crack in the concrete, his knees shaking. His stomach violently churned with raw, unfiltered terror. but he stepped in front of her anyway. "You're loading phantom freight," David said, forcing the words through his tight throat. "Medical tech and processors. You're logging it as departed, but diverting it to the I-95 holding yard." Miller's smirk faded, replaced by a dark, heavy scowl. He tapped the crowbar against his thick thigh. Thwack, thwack. "You're a smart guy, David," Miller said slowly, taking a step forward. The smell of cheap tobacco and sweat washed over them. "Too smart for a $160K babysitting job, but you ain't smart enough to know when to look the other way. You think you're gonna stop this truck? You and the lady? I got 3 guys here. You got a flashlight." "I don't need to stop the truck," David rasped, planting his feet. His hands were shaking so badly, he shoved them deep into his jacket pockets to hide them. "I just needed to see the physical cargo in the trailer, and now I have, which means I know Arthur is paying you." Miller stopped. His eyes darted to the 2 drivers, then back to David. "How do you know that name?" Miller demanded, his grip tightening on the iron bar. "Because I was married to his daughter for 4 years," David said. The words tasted like ash. "I know exactly who you're dealing with. Let me guess. He promised you a cut of the liquidation, maybe a consultant fee once he buys out Aegis. He told you this was a victimless corporate restructuring, right?" Miller didn't answer, but his jaw clenched. "He's playing you, Miller," David continued, his voice growing louder, the fear slowly being consumed by a deep, familiar bitterness. "Arthur doesn't have partners. He has pets. And when a pet gets messy, he puts it down. You think he's going to let a floor manager with a criminal conspiracy charge hang around his country club? You're committing federal interstate cargo theft. Do you honestly believe a billionaire is going to leave a loose end like you walking around with his name in your mouth?" Miller's breathing grew heavy. The crowbar stopped tapping. "He wired the money through a shell," Miller muttered defensively. "Untraceable." "Nothing is untraceable when you're the scapegoat," Nora interjected, stepping out from behind David. She didn't cower. She walked straight toward Miller, stopping barely 2 feet from the heavy iron bar. "Arthur is funding this to force a board vote at 8 o'clock this morning. The moment he takes control of my company, he will audit this depot. He will discover the theft. He will hand you and your drivers over to the feds to prove to the shareholders that he's cleaning house. He gets the company. You get 10 years in federal prison." The rain pounded against the roof. The diesel engine hummed. Miller stared at Nora, then looked at David. The absolute certainty in their faces was a suffocating weight. He looked back at his drivers. One of them took a slow step backward, eyes wide with sudden realization. "He gave me a burner phone," Miller said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "Text messages, dates, route instructions." "Give me the phone," Nora demanded, holding out her hand. "Give me the physical bills of lading for this truck. And you walk away. I won't press charges. I will let you vanish. But if you get in that truck, you belong to Arthur, and Arthur will bury you." Miller looked at the crowbar in his hand. He looked at the millions of dollars of stolen tech sitting in the trailer. Then, slowly, heavily, he reached into his grease-stained vest. He pulled out a cheap plastic flip phone and a stack of folded yellow manifests. He tossed them onto a wooden crate between them. "I want severance," Miller grunted, a desperate, pathetic attempt to reclaim some power. David let out a breathless, cynical laugh. "Severance is for the executives, Miller. Run!" Miller dropped the crowbar. It clanged loudly against the concrete. He turned and walked away into the shadows, the two drivers scrambling after him. David stood frozen for a long moment, staring at the discarded iron bar. The adrenaline began to crash, leaving him hollow, trembling, and violently nauseous. He bent over, resting his hands on his knees, sucking in deep, ragged breaths of the diesel-choked air. He had done it. He had actually done it. A hand lightly touched his shoulder. He looked up. Nora was holding the burner phone and the manifests. Her face was pale, but her eyes burned with a fierce, terrifying fire. "We have to go," she said softly. "We have 4 hours. High-altitude corporate spaces are designed to insulate you from the world." At 8 a.m., the boardroom on the 42nd floor of Aegis Innovations was silent, save for the soft, expensive hum of the climate control. The massive floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sweeping view of a gray, rain-slicked city. The air smelled of roasted espresso and leather. Arthur sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. He wore a navy bespoke suit that cost more than most people made in a year. His silver hair was perfectly swept back. He looked relaxed, bored almost. 3 board members, the ones he had bought, sat to his right, looking nervously at their glowing tablets. The heavy glass doors clicked open. Nora walked in. She was wearing the same bone-white blazer she had worn weeks ago, though it looked slightly rumpled now. She carried a sleek leather folder. Her face was an impenetrable mask. "Nora, darling," Arthur smiled, his voice oozing a sickly, paternal warmth. "Thank you for joining us. I know this is a difficult morning for you, but the bleed in the industrial sector is simply unsustainable. The board feels new leadership is required to stabilize the stock." "Is that so, Arthur?" Nora asked, taking her seat at the opposite end of the long table. She didn't open her folder. "And you believe your firm is best positioned to provide that leadership? A firm with zero background in predictive supply chains?" "We specialize in identifying bloat," Arthur countered smoothly, steepling his fingers. 14% shrinkage at your primary Eastern depot. That isn't just bloat, Nora. That is gross negligence. It shows a fundamental lack of operational control. "I agree," a voice said from the doorway. Arthur's smile vanished. David stood in the open doorway. He was a nightmare walking into a sterile dream. His gray t-shirt was stained black with carbon and grease. He walked into the room. Every board member stared at him in horrified silence. He looked directly at Arthur. "David?" Arthur's eyes narrowed, a flash of genuine confusion breaking his polished veneer. "What are you doing here? Security?" "I'm the operations director of Depot 42, David interrupted, his voice rough, scraping the pristine quiet of the room like sandpaper. He walked over to the mahogany table and slammed a heavy, grease-stained stack of yellow manifests down right in front of Arthur. The loud smack made 2 of the board members jump. "And I've identified the bloat," David continued. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the cheap plastic burner phone, and dropped it on top of the manifests. "Organized interstate cargo theft, ghost routing, funded by an external shell corporation that traces directly back to an offshore holding company registered to your primary wealth manager, Arthur." Arthur stared at the dirty yellow paper. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The air seemed to freeze. "This is absurd," Arthur said quietly, but his throat clicked. The relaxed posture was gone. His knuckles were white against the armrests of his chair. You are a disgruntled ex-son-in-law peddling conspiracy theories to extort me. It's a burner phone, Arthur, David said, leaning over the table, bringing his face close to the older man. He didn't care about the smell of his own sweat. He wanted Arthur to smell it. It has GPS metadata, text messages authorizing drops, audio recordings of you discussing the liquidation of Aegis assets. The FBI Economic Crimes Division has already been pinged with the data cache. Arthur looked at Nora. You have no proof I authorized anything. I don't need absolute proof for a conviction today, Arthur, Nora said coldly, opening her leather folder. I just need enough to trigger an SEC investigation. The moment I hand this to the federal authorities, your firm's stock will plunge. Your investors will pull out. You will spend the next 5 years in litigation hell. She slid a single, crisp white paper across the table toward him. Or, Nora continued, her voice perfectly level, you sign this. You withdraw your hostile bid. You surrender your current shares in Aegis at 20% below market value as compensation for the stolen freight. And you walk out of my building, never to return. Arthur stared at the paper. A vein throbbed in his temple. He looked up at David, his eyes burning with a venomous, hateful fury. You were nothing, Arthur whispered to David, the mask completely off now. You were a stray dog I let sleep on my porch. David looked down at him. He felt the mud on his boots. He felt the agonizing ache in his back from weeks of lifting heavy boxes. He felt the deep, undeniable exhaustion in his bones. And for the first time in his entire life, he felt absolutely, undeniably solid. I know, David said simply, but I bite now. Arthur stared at him for a long, agonizing moment. Then, with a jerky, trembling hand, he picked up a pen from the table and signed the document. He threw the pen down, stood up, and walked out of the room without another word. The 3 board members scrambled up and rushed out after him, leaving the door swinging shut. The boardroom was empty, save for David and Nora. I ruined your rug, he muttered. Nora looked at the mud. Then she looked up at him. She closed her leather folder. It was an ugly rug, she said, quietly. They stood there in the quiet room. There was no sudden rush of emotion, no cinematic embrace. The damage between them was too deep, too structural to be fixed by one frantic night. He had still left her when she needed him most. She had still used his desperation as a weapon. They were broken pieces that no longer fit together perfectly. You kept the job, Nora said, breaking the silence. The base salary remains, if you want it. David looked out the massive window. The rain was beginning to stop, the thick gray clouds slowly breaking apart to reveal the pale, morning sun. I want the job, David said, his voice raw but steady. But I'm not staying at the depot. I want a seat here, on this floor, and I want equity. Nora's eyebrows raised slightly, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing her features. She looked at his grease-stained hands, the dark circles under his eyes, the new, hardened set of his jaw. She didn't smile, but for the first time, she looked at him with genuine, unfiltered respect. Submit a proposal to HR by Monday, she said. David nodded. He turned and walked toward the door. He didn't look back as he stepped into the hallway, the heavy glass clicking shut behind him. He smelled like diesel and mud, but as he walked toward the elevator, he finally felt like he could breathe. What a wild ride. Do you think David truly redeemed himself? Or is he just playing a new, colder game? Will Nora ever forgive him? Or is their relationship purely transactional now? Let us know your deepest thoughts in the comments below. If this raw, gritty story kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a story of corporate warfare, and subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to ring the bell so you never miss our daily deep dives into human drama.